or 40 years ago, when I was closer to BC than I am now, if anybody had told me that the city of Vancouver would confer the freedom of the city on an anarchist, I would have said it's not very likely. If anybody had told me that they would confer the freedom of the city on a writer, I would have said impossible.
What does it mean when you refer to yourself as an anarchist in the 1990s?
It means to me, I suppose, a person to whom freedom is the most important thing. Intellectual freedom and, as far as possible, physical freedom.
George Woodcock, who lives in Vancouver, has been called Canada's foremost man of letters and the most civilized man in Canada. The historian Ramsay Cook once observed that George Woodcock writes faster than most of us can read. George Woodcock is a master of many areas of prose, biography, history, travel writing, criticism, autobiography, political theory. He's also an accomplished poet and a playwright. He's recently been turning his hand to fiction. He's a dedicated anarchist and a social activist whose charity has helped communities from BC to India and Tibet.
Well, I suppose it was all part of the atmosphere of the 30s. I started to write in the 1930s, and you'll find that a very large number of writers of that period, even writers not attached to political parties or not involved in specific political philosophies, like Graham Greene, for instance, became very much concerned with the condition of society at the time. And I think that the most of the people of my time were in the same position. People like Spender Orden, they have lost their political interest, largely because of the disillusionment of the years after the 1930s. But at that time, one was full of generous kinds of enthusiasm, and one really tended to seek for some kind of idealistic philosophy.
40 years ago, when George Woodcock came here from London, this was called Cherry Street, and you could still see vestiges of a cherry orchard and tracts of farmland. It's from this very quiet suburb called Kerrisdale that Canada's most famous anarchist has written most of his 120 books.
I think one of the basic things in my life is the death of my father, who died young, who was a man with enormous talents, particularly musical talents, who never had the chance to develop. And I think that after he died, I was, in a way, impelled by the idea of completing that life.
You've written that creativity often comes out of early wounds. What were your early wounds?
My early wounds were the English school system, among other things. Though I went to a very good school, still the kind of discipline. And it wasn't merely the discipline, it was the way in which the boys got what was called the school spirit, which in most English schools is a brutal kind of, a pro-sporty spirit that militates against the intellectual who is looked on as a weakling.
One of the most influential people in your life as an artist was the anarchist Marie-Louise Bernari.
She was the daughter of a very famous Italian anarchist, a professor who had to flee from Italy for his beliefs and who was slaughtered by the communists in Spain. And she was an admirable person, very beautiful and intellectually extraordinarily bright. And in a sense, she was the chief personal influence on me in bringing me towards anarchism. Orwell was the sort of man who was full of grievances. He was very loyal. Once he got to know you, he was extremely loyal. He hated passionately and irrationally. I remember people who were really quite decent people who had still tagged along a bit with the Stalinist bandwagon, and Orwell was full of contempt and fury against them. I fell into a disagreement with him in the Partisan Review. It was something he said, and I pointed out that after all, he was a former police officer in Burma. He had his face, he was attacking pacifists. He himself had been a pacifist 1 year before, and this kind of thing. And so I wrote this down, and Orwell wrote a furious reply. And then, somehow or other, through an Indian writer called Mulkraj Anand. He invited me to take part on his Indian program at the BBC. So I did, and we were very formal. And then I was getting onto a bus up at Hampstead one day, and I saw in front of me a familiar crest of hair. It was Orwell. He'd seen me come across the street. He turned and patted the seat beside him, so I went up, and he said to me, Woodcock, we may have differences on paper, but that doesn't mean anything derogatory to our relationships as human beings. And with that, our friendship started.
In the center of empire, with hearts beating high with pride and joy, crowds in their millions await the official word that victory has been won in the West. Britons from the dominions, the colonies, and the homeland, with guests from occupied
George Woodcock's
countries,
friendship
stand
with
as
George Orwell would eventually lead him to write his award-winning biography, The Crystal Spirit. But by the time World War II ended, England was not a comfortable place to be for conscientious objectors and anarchists. So George and his wife Ingeborg set their sights on the country where George had been born, and the land of his father's dreams, Canada. They followed the path of Doukhobor idealism to the west coast, where they homesteaded until they were discovered by the writer Earl Birney.
Earl Birney, well, Earl was the first writer in Canada that I knew. Earl actually came and visited me on Vancouver Island when we were living in a trailer and building a hut in 1949, in the summer of 1949.
When we first met, we were somewhat in comparable stations in life. We were poor and just making enough money to get by was very important. That's a pretty good bond.
Well, the shadboats were very important because we wouldn't really be in Vancouver if it weren't for the shadboats. We'd been living on Vancouver Island and we're getting pretty miserable at a village on Vancouver Island that I needn't name. Jack said to me, well, there's a cabin out in the bush outside behind our house. Maybe we can get you into that. At that time, all capital actually was forest. There were no houses. And it was wonderful living there among the forests, looking out over the harbour. That's where we started off in Vancouver. So Jack was really responsible for our coming to Vancouver. And then living together up on this hill, we became very close friends.
Their pattern was largely Inga acting as sort of good-natured critic of George. She would say, now, George, you're talking too much. Just quiet down, let us do talking, this sort of thing. She always adopted this sort of slightly critical stance toward George. I'd call it a stance, it was only good-natured. And obviously she loved him very dearly.
She's been a wonderful partner in my career. She cares for me in my sickness. She gives me ideas, which I sometimes badly need. And on the other hand, in the organization, she is a superb organizer. I am the ideologue of the group.
Another person with whom you corresponded a great deal was A.R.T. Could you tell me a little bit about your relations with Al and why you think you became close friends?
Well, a lot of people find it rather strange that we should be close friends. A rowdy poet and a cautious critic, as some people see me, and so that they think, well, this is just all that can be here is incompatibility. But in fact, that isn't true, because we've got a great deal in common: a poverty-stricken childhood with a domineering mother, a period scrounging any kind of job we could get, no university education, but enormous erudition arrived at just by reading. Al is one of the most erudite people I know.